Thanks to Kukila and Moana for organizing this panel and for inviting me to speak. You got a preview of my slides earlier. Okay. So in recent years, I've been doing research on very low-income households in Singapore. And the people I meet and the families I speak with are persons whose stories sit in the shadows of the Singapore story. It's extremely difficult to tell their stories and to have their stories received as neutral stories. Neutral stories. Stories that are not about right or wrong, stories that are not cautionary tales or sob stories. In the dominant narratives about our country and about ourselves, the stories are heard as outliers, as exceptions, and too frequently as failures. I try to tell the stories of people I meet as stories of complexity, of messiness, of sadness and strength, as challenges, but also lessons in humanity. But the responses to the stories, including from very well-informed and very well-meaning people, is frequently a tendency to want to pity, to normalize, to change, to rescue. I want to draw connections between them and us, to insert inequality into every sentence that I use where I also use poverty. I want to use the stories to shed light, not just on this small group, but on all of us and the conditions that we share. Yet, somehow, the moment the stories leave my desk, the word poverty echoes loudly, while the words inequality and wealth somehow melt into the background. Part of this is probably about my own communication skills, and I need to work harder to convey what I want to convey. But an aspect of this, I think, has to do with the common sense and the discursive frameworks that are dominant in our society. What is it about our national narratives that make it hard for the stories to be interpreted the way I want them to be? There is, of course, the actual script of the Singapore story, third world to first world, poor fishing village to global city, etc. Every school student can help you reconstruct some part of this script. In this script, the low income are a small group. They didn't transition from poor to rich. They must catch up. But if we look deeper, there's something else going on, something about the structure of the narrative. For several years now, I've been teaching a course on qualitative research methodology. On the second week of the course, to get students to think about how it is we know what we know, I show this slide. So really, I say actual slide because I didn't make it up after I saw the title of this panel, I promise. I don't have time to show these videos, so these are both titles of videos that I show to my students, an official National Day video and then an alternative National Day video. I don't have time to show these videos today, but you should definitely go watch them, especially that second one if you haven't already. It's great. And after viewing the video, I asked students to discuss the following questions. What are the truths? What are the truths about Singapore that the two videos tell? What are their narrative structures? What does the second video do that the first one does not? What is the Singapore story? What are the premises of the Singapore story? And what are the gaps of the Singapore story? And the purpose of showing these videos and then to have students discuss the contrast is to begin to articulate and clarify a key idea, that in any culture, things are often a lot more complex and complicated than a singular narrative can account for. If we're having a good day in class, as those of you who teach will know, sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you don't. But if we're having a good day in class, we manage to articulate this, that universalist accounts that try to squeeze complexity into a singular story, These accounts obscure the everyday realities of power differentials and marginalizes the experiences of structurally less powerful persons. In other words, the Singapore story is not just a bunch of specific events, people, scenes. It's not even just a specific interpretation of facts. It also gets us into the habit of thinking about reality in a specific way, where we are compelled to squeeze out difference, make claims about what everyone shares or is. It gets us into the habit of obscuring power differences, obscuring differences in power. The Singapore story is a sweeping story, a universalist story, a story that claims to fit everyone who is part of this nation. A universalist story is a story that flattens. Every actor is in lateral relation with every other actor. Sorry, I'm not very good with graphics. You know what I mean. A universalist story has no story for considering how different actors within a story might be hierarchically connected to one another. It is a story that blunts our thinking about how human connections may be imbued with power differences. So in my areas of research for the last few years, these are the things that tend to be framed as universals. First, family. The family is framed as being formed in one way, among specific configurations of gendered persons, at specific points in the life course, and then as evolving in particular constellations over the life course. And the constellation of relationships frames the family as being universal in its functions, particularly in terms of its care functions and its economic functions. Second, employment. Employment is central to being a worthy member of Singapore society. It is linked to the family in that certain members of a family must be employed, and other members can be non-employed, but only under specific conditions. Very importantly, employment is framed as universally valuable and universally accessible. Everyone who wants wage work can find wage work, and so there is no excuse for being unemployed except under extraordinary circumstances. A third thing that's often phrased as universal is education. This is the key to everything. The Singapore story insists that this is a meritocratic society. Formal education is the pathway toward good opportunities for jobs, stable income, security, well-being. In this story, anyone who works hard in school should be able to make good lives for themselves. Education is unquestionably and universally good. Each of these universalist claims are a wall I try to chip away at. Chip, chip. I have to do it partly by pointing out that each of these is framed as universally good, even though people have very different access to them. So for example, I talk about how kids from low-income households do not have access to the kind of training that would enable them to read and write by primary 1. I also point out that in their normative form, they each embody values that are good for some people, but rather bad for others. So for example, I see how staying married in order to be able to stay in Singapore and to be with their kids is a real hardship for non-Singaporean women married to Singaporean husbands who are not good spouses. I have spoken to different audiences about people in wage work, where people earn very low wages, have very little control over their time, and very little bargaining power vis-a-vis their employers. So I try to point out people have different access, and that in all of these relationships, in the family and employment, some things are good for some people, but conditions can be very bad for others. As it turns out, convincing people that people have different opportunities is the slightly easier part of my job. So people, when they hear these stories, they can see that the family is not a bastion of peace and love it's made out to be. They can admit that employment relations are not egalitarian relations. And many, many people can see that schools and these satellite enrichment centers are obviously not the ideal of equality. So I do what I can, chip away at some of these taken for granted things. But then I arrive at a certain limit that is harder to break through to. And I realize narratives are powerful because they aren't just stories out there, but stories in here. So the more formidable challenge that I face when I challenge universal narratives about family, about work, about education, is this: that individual narratives are grafted onto national narratives. People who have done relatively well within the national narrative, myself included, have a high stake in the structure of the universal narrative. The universality in flattening differences, in pretending neutrality, in obscuring power relations, lets us off the hook. Yes, people can admit the system is not working well, but to consider that perhaps the system is working exactly as it should, and that it is a game set up with winners and losers, where winners use various unfair tactics to stay winners, that is much harder to admit and much more challenging to our sense of who we are and what we are worth. The universal structure of the narrative, in other words, is a kind of legitimating tool. It enables us to think we are here because we played hard and we played fair. The flat universal structure is hard to give up because it is human to want to be legit. And so in my work and in responses to my work, it is much easier to talk about poverty than it is about inequality. It is much easier to invoke sympathy than it is to provoke unease. It is much easier to talk about what we want to do more for others than to consider what we want to give up of ourselves. Now how? I wanted to find a picture of a brown cow, but then I got busy. Also, it's lame, right? How does this matter to civil society? This is not a call for more self-reflexivity. I hesitate to call for that because self-reflection can very easily turn into navel-gazing. I think self-reflection is a necessary but insufficient condition for social change. I think if we are to ask people to give up something, including something deep about how they see themselves, then we have to offer some alternatives in return. I'm not saying this because I have concrete answers. I really don't, and it's perplexing that I don't. I'm saying this because I think as a community, we need to do more of this work of crafting alternatives that can be presented and shared. So this is a call for more collective imagination and articulation of alternatives. This is a call for more coming together to craft ideas about how we can do better to shift both national narratives and internal narratives, and shift them in ways that acknowledge power differences, but also have attractive options for a better shared future, where some of these power differences are reduced. So this is a call for more utopian and idealistic thinking, which is a really, really hard thing, but which I think activists are more equipped than anyone else to do. I think if we want to build a broader community of solidarity for various causes represented here today, the rest of today, the possibilities are there. But we need to understand that people's selves and dignity are grafted onto the national narrative. And we need to work harder at thinking about what future we are imagining that would be worth giving up being legit for. We need to have something that challenges not just the narratives out there, but the narratives in here. Thank you.